A janitor dies and leaves $8 million to charity. A banker making millions files for bankruptcy. Same world, same markets, wildly different outcomes. Morgan Housel spent years studying why smart people make terrible financial decisions while others with no formal training build lasting wealth. The answer isn't in spreadsheets or economic models. It's an understanding that money is 20% math and 80% psychology. The math is easy. The psychology is everything else. 4 big ideas from this book. 1. Coffee. Let's pour. First, wealth isn't what you earn, it's what you keep invisible. Second, your personal history shapes your money reality more than any textbook. Third, compounding isn't just about returns, it's about time and behavior. Fourth, room for error isn't pessimism, it's the secret to sleeping well. Ronald Read spent his mornings sweeping floors at a gas station and his afternoons pushing a broom as a janitor at J.C. Penney. He drove the same rusty Toyota for decades, bought his clothes at thrift stores, and when his shoes wore through, he taped them back together rather than buy new ones. When he died at 92, his neighbors figured he'd left behind maybe a few $1,000s, enough for a modest funeral. Instead, Ronald Read had quietly accumulated $8 million. Around the same time, a Merrill Lynch executive was filing for bankruptcy. This was someone who'd earned millions in annual bonuses, lived in a mansion, drove luxury cars, sent his kids to private schools, and looked every bit the part of financial success. Yet despite earning vastly more than Ronald Read ever did, he was broke. The story gets to something we fundamentally misunderstand about money. We think wealth is what we can see: the big house, the expensive car, the designer clothes, the exotic vacations posted on social media. But actual wealth, the kind that provides real security and freedom, is invisible. It's what you don't spend, not what you do. Ronald Read understood this intuitively. Every dollar he didn't spend on a newer car or fancier clothes was a dollar that could compound over decades. He wasn't depriving himself out of miserliness. He was building something powerful and hidden. The Merrill Lynch executive, meanwhile, was spending his considerable income as fast as it came in, maybe faster. He looked wealthy, but he was living paycheck to paycheck on a $1-million scale. This creates a strange paradox in how we perceive financial success. The person driving the brand new BMW might be drowning in car payments, while the person in the 10-year-old Honda might have a 7-figure investment account. The family in the McMansion might be leveraged to their eyeballs, while their neighbors in the modest ranch house might own their home outright and have enough saved to retire comfortably. We're wired to judge financial success by what's visible, but visibility and wealth often move in opposite directions. Every dollar you spend on looking wealthy is a dollar not building actual wealth. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with nice things, but there's a critical difference between buying them because you can truly afford them and buying them to signal that you can afford them. Think about your own life for a moment. When you see someone at a restaurant ordering expensive wine, or posting photos from their European vacation, or pulling up in a Tesla, what assumptions do you make? Most of us automatically assume they're doing well financially, but that expensive wine might be going on a credit card. That vacation might be financed. That Tesla might represent a monthly payment that's stretching their budget thin. The real millionaire might be the person at the next table ordering water and splitting an appetizer, not because they can't afford more, but because they've learned that wealth is built through what you don't spend, not what you do. They've figured out that every dollar saved and invested is a small employee working for them 24 hours a day, earning returns that compound over time. This isn't about living like a monk or never enjoying your money. It's about understanding that true financial security comes from the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and the wider that gap, the faster you build real wealth. The person who earns $50,000 a year and spends $40,000 is building wealth faster than the person who earns $200,000 and spends $190,000. Social media has made this even trickier to navigate. We're constantly bombarded with images of apparent wealth, luxury travel, expensive meals, designer everything. But social media shows us spending, not saving. It shows us consumption, not accumulation. The people building serious wealth aren't posting photos of their brokerage statements or their emergency fund balances. The most financially successful people often live surprisingly modest lives, not because they have to, but because they've learned that wealth is what you accumulate, not what you display. They've discovered the quiet satisfaction of watching their net worth grow, even if nobody else notices. They sleep better at night knowing they have options, even if those options aren't visible from the street. This invisible nature of wealth means that building it requires a different kind of satisfaction than spending money provides. When you buy something expensive, you get immediate gratification. You can see it, touch it, show it off. When you save and invest money, the gratification is delayed and largely invisible, but it's also more permanent and more powerful. Ask yourself, what would change about your spending if nobody could see what you bought? Morgan Housel tells the story of two investors who couldn't be more different in their approach to money, yet both are completely rational given their life experiences. Meet Jim and Sarah, both intelligent, well-educated people who lived through vastly different economic realities that shaped everything they believe about investing. Jim was born in 1945. By the time he turned 30, he had witnessed the stock market deliver an average annual return of nearly 10% for 2 decades straight. The Dow Jones had climbed from around 200 to over 800. Inflation was manageable, jobs were plentiful, and buying stocks felt like the most natural thing in the world. When Jim thinks about investing, his gut tells him that stocks go up over time because that's exactly what he experienced during his formative financial years. Sarah was born just 25 years later in 1970. By the time she turned 30, her experience was completely different. She had lived through the 1970s oil crisis, double-digit inflation that peaked at over 13%, and a stock market that went essentially nowhere for more than a decade. The Dow in 1982 was roughly the same as it had been in 1972. When Sarah thinks about investing, her instincts tell her to be cautious, to diversify beyond stocks, to prepare for economic turbulence because that's what shaped her understanding of how money works. Same country, same economy, but two completely different money personalities forged by the accidents of when they happen to be born. Jim sees opportunity where Sarah sees risk. Sarah sees prudence where Jim sees missed opportunity. Neither is wrong. They're both responding rationally to the data their lives have provided them. This reveals something profound about how we all think about money. Your personal history isn't just background noise in your financial decisions. It's the primary lens through which you view every investment, every purchase, every financial risk. The economic conditions you experience between roughly ages 10 and 30 become your baseline for normal. They form your intuitive sense of what markets do, what inflation feels like, what job security means, and what constitutes reasonable financial behavior. This explains why your parents might hoard cash in ways that seem irrational to you, or why your grandparents might be obsessed with owning their home outright. If you lived through the Great Depression, keeping money under the mattress doesn't seem paranoid. It seems prudent. If you came of age during the dot-com boom, the idea that you can get rich quick by picking the right stocks doesn't seem delusional. It seems obvious. The same principle applies to your everyday financial life right now. Think about how you approach spending on experiences versus saving for the future. If you graduated college during the 2008 recession, you probably have a different relationship with job security than someone who entered the workforce during the economic expansion of the 2010s. If your parents went through a messy divorce that involved financial chaos, you might approach joint accounts and shared financial goals differently than someone whose parents had a stable financial partnership. Your attitude toward debt, your comfort with market volatility, your sense of how much emergency savings you need, even your willingness to spend money on small daily pleasures like coffee or lunch out. All of these are shaped not just by your current financial situation, but by the economic stories that played out during your most impressionable years. This isn't about right or wrong approaches to money. It's about recognizing that what feels obviously correct to you might feel obviously wrong to someone else, and that difference often comes down to the different economic movies you each lived through. The person who seems irrationally conservative with their investments might have watched their parents lose their savings in a market crash. The person who seems recklessly optimistic about real estate might have grown up watching property values in their neighborhood triple. Understanding this can help you make better financial decisions because it allows you to step back from your gut reactions and ask whether they're based on current reality or past experience. It can also help you have better conversations about money with the people in your life, especially when their approach seems completely foreign to yours. Maybe they're not being stubborn or irrational. Maybe they're just responding to a different set of historical data points. The tricky part is that we can't easily separate our learned financial instincts from objective financial reality. We tend to assume that our personal experience represents the way things generally work, when in fact it might represent a very specific slice of economic history that may or may not repeat itself. Ask yourself, what economic story did you live through during your teens and 20s, and how might that story be quietly influencing financial decisions you're making today? Warren Buffett is worth over $100 billion today, but here's the thing that'll make you pause mid-sip of your coffee. He made 99% of that wealth after his 50th birthday, not because he suddenly became a better investor at 50, not because he discovered some secret formula or gained access to exclusive deals. He'd been investing successfully for decades already. The difference was simply time. By age 50, Buffett had been investing for nearly 30 years, and compound interest had finally reached that magical inflection point where the snowball becomes an avalanche. Morgan Housel uses Buffett's story to illustrate something most of us get backwards about money. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to time the market, looking for the perfect moment to buy or sell, obsessing over which investment will give us the highest returns this year or next. But Buffett's wealth tells a different story entirely. His annual returns weren't extraordinary by Wall Street standards, averaging around 20% over his career. Plenty of investors have beaten that in individual years. What made Buffett different wasn't his ability to time anything perfectly. It was his ability to stay in the game for an extraordinarily long time. This reveals something profound about how wealth actually builds. Time in the market beats timing the market, as the saying goes, but it's deeper than that. Time doesn't just help your investments grow. Time transforms the entire nature of how growth works. In the early years, your returns are small because your principal is small. A 20% return on $10,000 is $2,000. Nice, but not life-changing. But after decades of reinvesting those returns, a 20% gain on $10 million is $2 million. Same skill, same percentage, completely different outcome. The mathematics of compounding create this weird situation where most of your wealth gets built in the final years of your investing timeline, even though you've been doing the same thing all along. It's like climbing a mountain where the last 1,000 feet of elevation gain happen in the final 100 steps. Buffett understood this intuitively. He didn't try to get rich quick. He tried to get rich for sure, and he was willing to let time do most of the heavy lifting. But here's where this connects to your life right now, sitting here with your coffee, maybe looking at your retirement account or thinking about that investment app on your phone. You don't need to be Warren Buffett to benefit from this principle. You just need to start, and then you need to stay started. The 25-year-old who invests $500 a month in a boring index fund and never touches it will likely end up wealthier than the 35-year-old who waits until they can afford to invest $1,000 a month. Those 10 extra years of compounding matter more than the doubled contribution amount. This is hard for our brains to accept because we're wired for immediate feedback. We want to see our money grow quickly. We want to feel smart about our investment choices. We want to beat the market this quarter, this year. But the real wealth builders are the people who can tolerate being bored for decades. They're not checking their accounts daily or switching strategies based on market news. They're letting time do what time does best, which is multiply small, consistent actions into something much larger. The irony is that our culture celebrates the exceptions, the people who got rich quick, the traders who made fortunes in a few years. But for every one of those stories, there are thousands of people who tried the same approach and lost everything. Buffett's approach seems boring by comparison, but boring has a remarkable track record when you give it enough runway. Think about other areas where this principle shows up. The writer who publishes consistently for 20 years builds a much larger audience than the one who tries to go viral with each post. The person who exercises moderately but regularly for decades stays healthier than the one who does intense workout phases followed by long breaks. Time rewards consistency more than intensity, patience more than cleverness. What makes this particularly relevant now is that we're living longer than previous generations. If you're 30 today, you might have 40 or 50 years of investing ahead of you. That's an enormous advantage if you use it, or an enormous missed opportunity if you don't. The question isn't whether you can pick the perfect stock or time the perfect entry point. The question is whether you can start now and keep going. Ask yourself, what would you do differently with your money today if you truly believed that time was more powerful than timing? In 1998, Russia's finance minister stood before international investors with what appeared to be reassuring numbers. Russia's debt-to-GDP ratio sat at a seemingly manageable 50%. On paper, the math worked perfectly. The country could service its obligations, the fundamentals looked sound, and by most traditional metrics, everything pointed toward stability. The finance minister had every reason to feel confident in those projections. But confidence built on paper-thin margins has a way of evaporating when reality intrudes. When investor sentiment shifted and panic began to spread, those perfectly reasonable numbers became irrelevant overnight. Russia defaulted anyway, not because the math was wrong, but because the math didn't account for the one thing that always matters most, the unexpected. This is the essence of what Housel calls room for error, and it's perhaps the most crucial concept in all of personal finance. Being right on paper means absolutely nothing if you haven't built in space for being wrong in practice. The Russian finance minister learned this the hard way, but we don't have to. Room for error isn't pessimism disguised as financial planning. It's the recognition that the future refuses to follow our spreadsheets. Markets crash when they're supposed to rise. Jobs disappear when they seemed secure. Medical bills arrive when budgets are already stretched. The specific surprise doesn't matter as much as the certainty that some surprise is coming. Think about how this plays out in your own financial life right now. Maybe you've calculated that you can afford that house payment because it's exactly 30% of your income. The math checks out perfectly. But what happens when your company restructures and your hours get cut? What happens when the transmission dies in your car the same month your dog needs emergency surgery? The original calculation wasn't wrong, but it didn't leave room for life to happen. This is why the most successful investors aren't necessarily the smartest ones. They're the ones who assume they're going to be wrong about something important and plan accordingly. Warren Buffett doesn't just look for good companies at fair prices. He looks for great companies at prices that would still make sense even if he's wrong about half of his assumptions. That's room for error in action. The practical application here isn't complicated, but it does require fighting against our natural instincts. We want to optimize. We want to squeeze every dollar of efficiency out of our financial plans. We see money sitting in a savings account earning practically nothing and feel like we're leaving returns on the table. But that emergency fund isn't really about the returns. It's about buying yourself the luxury of not being forced into terrible decisions when things go sideways. Room for error shows up in how much house you buy. Not the maximum the bank will approve, but something comfortable enough that you could still afford it if your income dropped by 20%. It shows up in your retirement planning. Not saving just enough to hit your target number, but enough to still be okay if the market delivers lower returns than expected, or if you end up needing to retire earlier than planned. It shows up in your career choices too. Maybe that high-paying job with the startup looks attractive, but what's your backup plan if the company folds in 18 months? Having room for error means keeping your skills sharp, your network active, and your expenses low enough that you could weather a period of unemployment without panic. The beautiful thing about building in room for error is how it changes your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of lying awake at night worrying about all the things that could go wrong, you sleep better knowing you've already accounted for most of them. You're not trying to predict the future perfectly. You're just making sure you can survive it imperfectly. This doesn't mean hoarding cash under your mattress or avoiding all risk. It means being honest about the difference between what you think will happen and what you know will happen. You think the stock market will deliver reasonable returns over the long term, but you know there will be years when it doesn't. You think your job is secure, but you know that industries change and companies restructure. Room for error is what transforms financial planning from a high-wire act into something more sustainable. It's the difference between a financial plan that works only if everything goes exactly right and one that works even when most things go wrong. Ask yourself, where in your financial life are you assuming everything will go according to plan, and what would happen if it doesn't? Wealth is what you don't see. The flashy car in the driveway tells you nothing about someone's net worth. It just tells you what they spent money on. Real wealth is the money sitting quietly in accounts, growing invisibly. Your history shapes your reality. A person who lived through the Great Depression will think about risk differently than someone who came of age during a bull market. Neither is wrong. They're just operating from different lived experiences with money. Time beats timing. The person who starts investing early and stays consistent will almost always outperform the genius trying to time the market perfectly. Compound interest rewards patience, not cleverness. Room for error is everything. The most important financial decision isn't picking the perfect investment. It's making sure you can survive the inevitable surprises. Having a margin of safety lets you stay in the game when things go sideways. Look at your biggest monthly expense that others can see: your car payment, rent in a fancy neighborhood, designer clothes, and ask yourself honestly whether it's building wealth or just broadcasting income. If it's the latter, consider redirecting even half of that amount into an investment account. You'll be trading visible spending for invisible wealth, which is exactly where financial security lives. That's one book, one coffee. Next coffee, Atomic Habits.